Welcome back to the channel. Today we will be comparing the 2008 Lexus ISF against the new 2022 IS500. Ever since the ISF was discontinued about a decade ago, Lexus performance car enthusiasts have been clamoring for a new version. The IS500, while it is an F Sport model and not a true ISF, does offer a lot of the things that made the ISF great. But we'll get into that a little bit later. First of all, let's talk about this ISF. Since it is a 2008, it is the very first model year, which means it's the pre-facelift version. And the crucial part of that is that it did not come with a limited slip differential as standard. Later model years, I think 2010 and up, came with a Torsen LSD. However, this ISF is not stock. The owner, Anthony, has done quite a few mods to address its shortcomings. So I'll go through some of the main items on the mod list, but I'll put the full list in the video description. By the way, this car has over 177,000 miles, a true testament to the reliability of Toyota and Lexus products, especially the engines. So we have a PTS JoeZ catback dual exhaust, HKS Hipermax S coilovers with a Lexus F Sport rear sway bar, and crucially, we have the Giken Superlock 1.5-way LSD. We're also on some beautiful Advan GT Beyond wheels. Tire size is the same front and rear. We're on some Continental Extreme Contact Sport 255/35/19. And of course, we have some exterior parts as well, like the carbon hood, the splitter, and the SARD wing. With that out of the way, a few specs about this car. It weighs right around 3,800 pounds, pretty heavy, but still lighter than that IS500 as we're about to find out. It's powered by a 5-liter naturally aspirated V8, making 416 horsepower and 371 pound-feet of torque. The transmission is an 8-speed automatic from Eisen. We have front double wishbone suspension and rear multi-link. I've driven this car when it was stock, so I'll try to comment on how the new IS500 feels compared to this in terms of suspension and so forth. Super cool startup from the gauge cluster, VSC off. And then we'll put the car into sport mode, which enhances the throttle response and may actually increase the steering weight as well. What a great sound. Ooh, I do not like how touchy this throttle response is in sport mode. We're actually gonna put it back into normal. Yeah, that's much better, much more progressive and linear throttle pedal. Whoa, hit that rev limiter there. Even though this car has over 178,000 miles, I would have no problem believing it still makes the advertised 416 horsepower. Definitely, I can feel the car's weight in the corners, but it's still very controllable. It feels pretty neutral. I'm sure that's helped by this square wheel and tire setup. Now, this HKS Hipermax S coilover, I have mixed feelings about it so far. I think it gives a good amount of compliance. It doesn't feel overly stiff at low speed and over small bumps, but when I start pushing the car, it doesn't have very good body control. It does seem to get a little bit floppy, a little bit too animated in the corners. See, right there, when I went over that bump at full throttle, the rear skipped just a tiny little bit, just enough to make me lose confidence for a split second. And with this transmission, you actually have to pull the paddle to upshift slightly early, just before you get to redline, because of that delay in the shift speed. So the car definitely feels like a 15-year-old car, but that doesn't mean it's not still a ton of fun to drive. Yeah, this transmission, ugh, not the best. Brakes feel good from these Brembos, OEM Brembos. 6-piston front. There we go. This Giken LSD doing its job, that's for sure. Giving me a little bit of slip angle, but very controllable with the throttle and not snappy in any way. Yeah, see, over some of those bumps at higher speed, the suspension just isn't able to cope. The car just starts moving around laterally and vertically. But once we dial it back, once we slow down, the suspension feels fine. It's actually quite plush. It's pretty soft. That's a bummer. I did have high hopes for the HKS Hipermax S. Maybe I just have a bad memory, but I thought the body control with the stock suspension might have been a little bit better. Ooh, that slow upshift there. Got some rub there. Woo, yes. A few degrees of counter steer around some of these corners. So fun with this car. That's the redeeming quality of this car with an aftermarket LSD. Even if the car feels heavy. Oh, I had to brace myself for that crest because I just knew the suspension wasn't going to be able to handle it. But yeah, even if this car does feel heavy, it does feel its weight, the transmission definitely showing signs of age 15 years later. And this electric power steering system, good weighting, average feedback, I would say. Definitely not as much feedback as I would like to get from a performance-focused car. But despite all of that, the OS Giken LSD makes this car so much fun to drive because you can just control those little bits of oversteer. In fact, the owner, Anthony, takes this thing to drift events, to some of the Thunderhill skid pad events, for example, and just has a blast. And that's where this car, I think, really does put a huge smile on my face. Let's do one more little straight line pull. Pull the paddle a little early. Oh, still not early enough apparently. There we go. Oh man, great engine, amazing engine. It's not a torque monster down low, but it certainly has enough torque, I would say, for a 3,800 pound car. But the great part is that it rewards you for winding it out to its roughly 7,000 RPM redline. So the highs for this car, for me, are definitely the engine and the aftermarket limited slip differential. I'm sure the later model years of this car with the Torsen limited slip diff offer a good percentage of the fun factor that this OS Giken unit provides. But overall, like I said, this car does show signs of its age, but it's still a very, very fun car once you put the right choice mods on it. Let's hop into the IS500 and see if it feels like a modern version of this car. Let's see if it actually addresses some of the deficiencies of this original 08 ISF. All right, we're now in the 2022 Lexus IS500 F Sport. First impressions, this car is a lot more refined than the old ISF. A lot of people give this car flack for not having the best interior for a brand new car, and I do agree with that to some extent, but I will say at least the build quality is really nice. No squeaks and rattles, even when I'm driving on rough pavement, so I'm personally pretty impressed by this interior. I value build quality over design. Now, onto the specs of the IS500. Like the old ISF, it also has a 5-liter naturally aspirated V8, but in this application, it makes 472 horsepower and 395 pound-feet of torque. So a good 50 to 60 horsepower over the ISF, but this car does weigh closer to 3,900 pounds, so about 100 to 150 pounds heavier. Power to weight ratio is still better, however. Now this car does have a rear limited slip differential as standard. It also has electric power steering, an 8-speed Eisen automatic transmission, and it still has double wishbone front suspension, as well as multi-link rear. Nice throaty V8 startup. Love this LFA inspired gauge cluster. So we're gonna use the style here to put it into Sport S Plus, which the owner Leonard refers to as the LFA driving mode. And then we're gonna hold the traction control button for a few seconds to turn VSC fully off. If you press it once, it'll be off, but it'll turn itself back on when it detects excessive wheel spin, which is weird because what's the point of turning it off if it just turns back on? That's all well and fine, but now this little annoying screen pops up right in the middle of the tachometer that says VSC turned off, pre-collision brake system unavailable. Pet peeve of mine with both the ISF and the IS500 is the fact that in manual mode, if you want to use the gear lever to shift, you have to push forward for upshifts and pull towards you for downshifts. It should be the other way around. This car also has adaptive dampers, which we have in the firmer setting right now. Another very heavy car, but at least we have the joys of a naturally aspirated high revving V8. This one revs out even higher, I believe, to around 7,300 RPM. Driving over some of the gravel on this road here, a lot less of that noise is being transmitted into the cabin compared to the ISF. Ooh. Leonard did upgrade the front brakes with ISF Brembo 6-piston calipers. The OEM calipers on this car, they're 4-piston, but Leonard told me that the pads themselves are like this big. So if you track this car with stock brakes, you will destroy the pads and potentially have brake failure and go into a wall, as some folks have actually already experienced. Transmission does seem a tad quicker to upshift compared to the ISF, but there's definitely still a delay. It's no dual clutch, and it's no ZF 8-speed. Ooh, very slow shift there. Steering is a little bit lighter, even in the Sport S Plus mode, compared to the ISF, but that's fine because these steering racks, these e-pass systems, in both cars don't have much feedback, so extra weight isn't really going to give you anything of value. Suspension so far feels pretty good. It's a dual-purpose, daily plus semi-fun suspension setup. It's really compliant over the bumps. It rides beautifully over broken pavement and gravel, but don't expect amazing body control when you're pushing the car. We're on some 10mm upsized Michelin PS4S tires, 245 in the front, 275 in the rear, with a slightly taller sidewall than OEM. Now that's why you buy the IS500, not necessarily for razor sharp handling or on-track prowess, but the fact that you have a naturally aspirated V8 in a brand new car. How good is that sound, that pure induction note? It's not overly loud, but it's just right in the tone. It's so good, it's so good. Really hustle it through some of these corners, the higher speed corners at least. Not much steering feel here, but at least the steering is precise, it's accurate. You can place the front end fairly well for such a heavy car. Ooh, that transmission's struggling there. Understeer on throttle. The car definitely could use front grip. It definitely does default to turn and understeer. It's definitely not as easy to play with the front to rear balance of this car compared to the ISF. Obviously that ISF has that OS Giken, or is it OS Giken, aftermarket LSD, and it has a square tire setup, which just makes it a lot more neutral in the corners. I think if you did the same with this car, it could potentially feel better than the ISF in some ways. I do think this suspension is a good step up from even the stock ISF suspension, specifically for dual purpose driving. I think having a slightly softer suspension on a tight, bumpy road like this actually does make this heavy car feel a little bit more predictable, I would say. The brakes feel really good. The upgraded ISF calipers and some DS2500 pads. Really confidence inspiring going into corners. Kind of surprising given how heavy this car is. This car's tackling the downhill just fine. And the throttle response in Sport S Plus mode is actually a lot more linear, a lot more controllable compared to Sport mode in the ISF. Yep, handles that crest a lot better than the ISF with the HKS coilovers. Really impressed with the IS500. This is not meant to be a canyon carver or a track weapon, and yet with a couple of tweaks that Leonard has done, like upsizing the tires just a tad, giving it a better front caliper, and some small suspension bushing upgrades, this car feels like a proper little sleeper that happens to be also incredibly refined. Is it as playful as Anthony's ISF? Obviously not. Anthony has done quite a bit of work to his car to make it handle the way he wants. But I see no reason why you couldn't do something similar to the IS500, assuming you can actually find quality aftermarket parts for it. Apparently, aftermarket support for this car is still pretty limited. Let's hear this V8 sing one more time. Oh, missed the paddle with my finger, so it just bounced off the rev limiter in second. Hey, at least it won't automatically upshift when you have it in manual mode. That's nice. I'll give it credit where credit's due. Oh man, I think the engine in this car actually sounds a bit better than the engine in the ISF. Oh, by the way, this does have an RR Racing catback exhaust, but most of the sound you get from inside the cabin when you're pushing the car is intake sound anyways. And despite what they say about the synthetic engine sound in this car, I think it sounds really good. Even though I've reviewed this car once before, that was on an unfamiliar road. And now that I'm driving it for the second time on a road that I basically know by heart, my appreciation for the IS500 has actually grown quite a bit. I really like the dual purpose nature of this car. I'll say it again. It's so comfortable, it's so refined, the interior has no squeaks and rattles. This car has almost 14,000 miles. I mean, my BRZ at 11,000 miles is already rattling like a tin can from some places, but this car just feels so solidly built. And if the ISF is any indication of what owning a Lexus can be like, I mean, look at Anthony's 178,000 miles and it still runs basically like brand new. This IS500 is a car I could see myself owning for a very long time. As a daily driver that can still do the occasional canyon day. Now, obviously, that comes at a price. Leonard mentioned that you can get a brand new IS500 nowadays for either MSRP or maybe up to $5,000 over. So that puts this car at right around $65,000, maybe 70 grand, give or take. Compare that to an early ISF with some miles on it, and you're looking at, yeah, basically 3 times the price. But I do feel like it is a lot more car if it's going to be your everyday car. The ISF just has some deficiencies, the old interior, the even slower to shift transmission, and some of the performance deficiencies that I mentioned with the pre-facelift model that make it perhaps a good value proposition for a project car. But if you want to do minimal mods, I think ponying up for the IS500 really is the way to go. It's a lot more money, yes, but I'll say it again, you get a lot more car. Thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you think of this comparison. If you've driven both the ISF and the IS500, do you agree that the IS500 is a lot more refined? And do you think the ISF is actually more fun to drive on a canyon road or on a racetrack? Let me know your thoughts. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.